the over-officiating of how we attend a game and how we support our teams at a game draws people away from the game. You know, we had a ridiculous case where a few weeks ago where fans were being ejected from a stadium because they were standing on their seats.
Right.
Let's understand football culture a bit better as a country and encourage that type of behaviour.
Welcome back to The Last Days of Rome. Today's guest is Michael Zappone, a football broadcaster and the founder of Nominis, a media advisory company with a lot of big-name clients. With Michael, I talk about the state of Australian football, Ange Postecoglou, and what makes a good reputation. I hope you enjoyed the chat.
So let's start with the Socceroos.
Mm-hmm.
Currently top of the group. They've qualified for the third round of Asian World Cup qualifiers. What have you made of the campaign so far, and do you see the remaining two games as an opportunity to give some younger players a run?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a choice for Graham Arnold, isn't it? I think one of the things that he talks about is that, you know, every game's important because there are ranking points associated with every game you play. So with the Asian Confederation, the way that the new World Cup will work, there'll be 3 groups of 6 teams in the next phase of qualification. So the aim is to be one of the top 3 ranked nations in Asia. And currently Australia is ranked 4th as we sit here today. South Korea is just ahead of Australia, marginally by a point. So if Australia were to win the next 2 games and Korea were to drop points, then the Socceroos would overtake South Korea and then become one of the top 3 ranked nations.
Right, it's about the seeds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then if you're one of the top 3 seeds, your draw in effect should be a little bit easier than that of the team that finishes 4th. So it is complex, but it's a long way of me trying to explain that he will find a balance. He will still want to win those last 2 games. But I think he's done a good job over the years of bringing in new talent and blooding new talent. And we've seen the evolution of the team. In the last camp, there were only 10 players who played at the World Cup. So in a squad of 26 players, 16 of them were not part of the World Cup. And the World Cup was not even 2 years ago. So that's a big turnover.
I'm probably going to regret saying this, but do you think it should almost be impossible for us not to qualify at this point with 8 Asian teams given direct qualification and then plus a 9th spot via the Intercontinental Playoff? I mean, it's got to be a done deal for countries like Australia going forward, right?
It should be on the surface, absolutely. And we've qualified for every World Cup since 2006 when there were fewer places. So ever since we've come into Asia, it has certainly helped us on that big stage. But we have seen the last 2 World Cups that the Socceroos under Ange had to go through playoffs, and under Graham Arnold in the last one had to go through that dramatic
they were both great
shootout
games.
Against Peru. So you're right, there are more places. We should qualify. But what I will say is, as we've seen in the last Asian Cup, there are a lot more emerging countries in Asia, and they're spending a lot of money. They have a lot of money. So when you look at the likes of Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular, they are spending millions upon millions upon millions in developing talent. They have money that we don't have to spend on developing players.
Do we have any money? In terms of funding, we receive nothing.
Well, again, and it's one of the messages that we need to get out there, is that the government needs to support our sport, because it is very happy to support the big codes like the AFL and the NRL and spend hundreds of millions of dollars on facilities for those sports and for funding for those sports. But unfortunately, football does not get it. We get the raw end of the deal there. So the government needs to do more, absolutely. And Graham Arnold's spoken about the fact that we don't have a home of football. So in the last camp, we were training at the New South Wales Rugby League headquarters. It's actually laughable.
Right.
So we don't have the facilities to be able to help our junior teams. And it's not just the Socceroos, it's the junior teams that would benefit from that in the long run.
Where would you put the home of football? Because something that we were just talking about before we started recording was the fact that Sydney does have a grasp on power in the context of football. So is it inevitable that it would be in Sydney?
I think it has to be in a major capital, because if you think about the logistics of flying players in and out of Europe or Asia, because the majority of our team is based in Asia, in Europe and overseas. So our last camp, as an example, we had players coming in 2 days before the game, playing a Sunday night game in Italy and arriving in Melbourne or in Sydney on Tuesday, and the first game was on Thursday. So there has to be an easy passageway, whether it's Melbourne or Sydney. There have to be one of those two cities.
So it has to be one of those two, in your opinion?
I think so. I think just because of the fact that if you look at Italy, they have a national team headquarters just outside of Florence, Coverciano. If you look at England, they have a national team headquarters as well, which is within easy reach of London. That is the gold standard, and we need to aim for the gold standard.
In the context of Italy, though, Florence isn't even one of the biggest 3 cities in Italy. So you don't think there's room to have it? I mean, I'm biased towards Adelaide, I'll admit that right now, but Brisbane, Adelaide, there's just no hope. I mean, Adelaide, Johnny Warren called it the capital of football. So I think what I'm questioning is this assumption that Melbourne and Sydney have to get everything.
We should be playing more games in Adelaide, but I'll come back to that in a moment. I think if you look at Italy as an example, all of their players are based within an hour's flight of Florence. So if you're looking from a logistics perspective, getting players into camp, it's a lot easier to do that in Italy.
Sure.
And that's why I think we need to have that centre of football in a capital city. Because if you're Alessandro Circati and you're playing in Parma and you have to fly to Adelaide for a camp to play a World Cup qualifier for your national team, how are you going to get to Adelaide? It's an extra flight and extra few hours of travel time that you could probably do without.
Yeah, you're certainly right. Italy's a much smaller place, plus Tuscany is central Italy, right? So they can come from both below and above.
And most of the Italian national team players are playing in Italy, and if they're not, they're in France. Or wherever, somewhere else in Europe.
I just had to make a case for Adelaide to get something. That's it.
But we should send out a message to the Premier of Adelaide, or South Australia, that we need to have the Socceroos in Adelaide. The Matildas are playing there, which is great. The Socceroos haven't played in Adelaide. I was talking to Craig Goodwin about this, who's an proud Adelaide boy, for 7 years.
Right.
So the next phase of World Cup qualifiers for the Socceroos are in September, October and November this year. One of those games has to be in Adelaide, but we need the support of the South Australian government to do that.
They haven't been supportive so far. And why do you need the support? Because wouldn't it just be a direct negotiation with the stadium? I don't know how this works.
So often it's a negotiation with state governments. So state governments look at these opportunities and invest some money to help meet some of the costs of getting teams there. They'll find that investment is a worthwhile investment because it attracts visitors to Adelaide in this case. So the last games were played in Canberra and in Sydney, and in both cases I think both governments helped support that. So Destination New South Wales was one of the partners of those last games, and it helps attract people to Canberra. So both games were sold out, both in Sydney and in Canberra. So the popularity of the Matildas and the Socceroos, I think, is growing. And the Matildas are off the charts.
They've blown up. The last year, they have blown up. I mean, their followers on social media far surpass the Socceroos now. Sam Kerr, in the last couple of years, has become a household name. And we'll come on to that in a moment, but let's just quickly return to the home of football for a moment. If it is, let's just say it's going to be Sydney, because that's where it probably will be, isn't the risk, though, that it could mitigate the growth of football in this country, because then all of the Socceroos games will be there in this equivalent of Wembley?
I don't think that they would all be there. So I think what you'd have is you'd come into camp.
So just the training ground would be there?
To train, to prepare, and then you'd fly to the destination of the game the day before the game.
So you don't advocate for having an equivalent of Wembley, where we just play all of the national team games at this one stadium. It becomes like a destination for national team
I think it's a training venue, it's a preparation venue, it's a centre of excellence where all the junior teams can prepare and get ready for camps, but not one national stadium like Wembley.
Right, got it. I listened to a podcast that you were on very recently, and to use your phrase, you spoke about negative Nellies.
Yeah.
And people who are... well, first of all, I want to ask you, how would you define negative Nellies? It can't be anyone who sees problems with the game, because you and I imagine, would both have our opinions of that. Is it just people who are toxically disparaging of football in Australia? What is it? And does it bother you?
It bothers me. So much so that I've been working in the game for 20 years. I often consider deleting my X account, my Twitter account, because I find that the majority of commentary on there is negative. Now, whether that's because it's just the platform itself, or whether that's the overarching view of football in Australia, I'm not sure. You tell me, but I'm pretty close to it. There are a lot of good things that happen in our sport, and there are a lot of things that need to improve. The current status and health of the APL is concerning. It needs to be addressed. There are a lot of clubs that aren't making money. There are a lot of clubs who are struggling financially. Crowd numbers have been better. It is not all negative, but I think that a lot needs to be done. We're 18 seasons into the A-League, and what we should be seeing is growth year on year, but it has stagnated. In some cases, it's gone backwards.
Right, and this is kind of where I'm at. I wouldn't consider myself a negative Nelly, maybe more of a defeatist Nelly. You can steal that one. In the sense that if we look at support for the national teams, like we were just saying, the Socceroos and the Matildas, the support's really strong. Look at the live sites around the country during both World Cups. The Socceroos just had their most successful World Cup ever. The Matildas, Australia just hosted the most successful Women's World Cup ever in terms of ticket sales and attendances. I believe also in TV views as well, but I'm not too sure of that. We have the highest participation rate of any code in the country. But despite all this, Australians just won't support the domestic league. And I can't see light at the end of that tunnel. So maybe that does make me negative. I follow the A-League. I love my club, but I don't seem to be as positive as you are. Why am I wrong?
I think you're wrong because there is enough understanding of the game, enough love of the game, enough people playing the game in this country for it to be revived. If we look at the halcyon years of the A-League, when we had the Alessandro Del Pieros and the Emil Heskys and the Shinji Onos here, I'm not saying the marquees are the solution, but marketing and thinking outside the square sometimes can help. And how it can help is it then attracts the theatre goers, because the people that were going to watch Del Piero were theatre goers. They were people that grew up watching him play for Juventus. And all of a sudden they go to an A-League game and think, well, actually, this is not so bad. But normally they wouldn't be interested in watching Sydney FC versus Newcastle Jets, because that's the first game he played and he scored a free kick in front of a packed Sydney football stadium. And then it evolved from there. It gained momentum and then somehow lost momentum. And it's not just about Del Piero, but it's about the marketing of the league and showing the theatre goers that this is actually a great league, an entertaining league to watch. We have to include, not exclude people from wanting to be there. So the overzealousness of security firms and police and the over officiating of how we attend a game and how we support our teams at a game draws people away from the game. You know, we had a ridiculous case where a few weeks ago where fans were being ejected from a stadium because they were standing on their seats.
Right.
Let's understand football culture a bit better as a country and encourage that type of behaviour, not push it away. Because I've got a son who's 18 and he'll go to the odd game. He'll go to the game. He'll stand in a terrace with his mates. He doesn't want a premium seat on the halfway line. He wants to be in the terrace with his mates, chanting, jumping up and down. And that's an experience for him. That's a unique experience. We also grew up with AFL. I was at the AFL the other day with all my kids. It's a very different experience. It's not a bad experience. It's just a different experience.
Right.
And I think both can survive and both can flourish in this marketplace. But it's a tough marketplace to get it right in.
You touched on something there, which is a kind of historical maligning of Australian football that we've seen historically. Yeah, I mean, do you think that's a hangover of something else? Maybe the first thing that comes to my mind is the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that maybe football, that outsiders of the game still carry with them when they look at football. Like, look at these, like you were saying, unsafe crowds, hooligans, and so on. Often I believe that, football is used as the conduit through which diverse communities are maligned on certain channels, let's just say.
And sometimes we don't do ourselves any favour, right? Because just after the World Cup, we had great momentum as a sport. You mentioned Federation Square. I was at the World Cup working with the Socceroos and showing the players those videos of the impact they had back home. They were blown away by it. But then a couple of weeks after that, there's a Melbourne derby and a handful of idiots decide to storm the pitch and throw missiles at a player. And so then we're back to square one.
Right.
So we need to understand that we also need to behave ourselves as a fan group, and then educate those. But you're right, I think there is a bias.
Right.
Maybe it's an unconscious bias amongst government or amongst police or amongst security firms about how we are as individuals or spectators.
Another thing I want to talk about is I'm kind of sick of us being football fans. We're kind of the Mormons of Australian sport, where we're constantly having to do this, having to proselytize, having to convince other people how great our game is. And that's another thing I don't know, man. Like, are they going to get it? This is where I'm probably a lot more negative than you are. I mean, you seem very hopeful, but how long do we do this for?
I think that'll always be the case. But I look at our evolution as a sport, and you look at leaders that we've had in the sport. So when I say leaders, Ange Postecoglou is the current example of a leader in the sport who's breaking down new barriers. He's the first Australian to become an English Premier League coach, and he's become a very successful one at that instantly. So he's breaking through those barriers. All of a sudden, you've got AFL people, NRL people wanting to go and visit Ange in Tottenham to understand what he's doing. He's a hero. And so he's a flag bearer for our sport in this country. So I think that we will always battle, because we'll always be behind the AFL if you live in the southern states. We'll always be behind the NRL if you live in New South Wales or Queensland. But as we've seen, week in, week out, it is difficult to break through those barriers. But this sport unites. And with our national teams, they are the most popular national teams. The Matildas are the most popular national team across Australia.
100%.
There's no arguing that fact. And the Socceroos aren't far behind them. So it might be that we're battling week in, week out, but there is a true love for our code and for our national teams. And we have to hang on to that and leverage that.
You brought up Ange. Were you looking at my notes? Because
No.
that's exactly where I was going. What have you made of his time at Tottenham specifically, and also Celtic as well?
Yeah.
I mean, so many Australians are following Ange specifically. I don't think in my life I had ever watched an SPL game. I watched almost every Celtic game for 2 years straight because of him. What did you make of his first 2 seasons in Europe, and then where do you see the Ange narrative at right now with Tottenham?
I love how honest he is. I love how frank he is, and he hasn't changed. That's the way he'd talk to Australian media. That's, I would interview him as the Brisbane Roar coach or as the Melbourne Victory coach, and he is exactly the same when he's answering questions with the media in the UK. I was lucky enough to travel over there for Channel 10 and spend some time with him at Celtic. When he won his first championship there at the end of the first season, and to be in the stadium on the day that they were handed over the trophy. So they'd already secured the title, so it was a celebration. It was the final game of the season. They were doing the trophy presentation. It was Tom Rogic's last game, so it had everything. There were 60,000 fans in there, all supporting one team. And the chants for Ange and the chants for Tommy Rogic, they love the guy. And they still do, even though he left after 2 seasons. So he made an instant impact. We know that there were a lot of naysayers globally saying, who's Ange who? And some famous, TV presenters talking about the fact that he would fail. He proved them wrong. He continues to prove people wrong, even in the UK now and in the English Premier League, because, again, that's another step up. So it doesn't surprise me that he was picked up by Tottenham. It doesn't surprise me that he was successful at Celtic. It doesn't surprise me he was successful at Tottenham. And I think they'll finish, in Europe. That is a success for Tottenham based on what's gone before them in previous years. That'll give him the impetus to bring in more players and potentially next season challenge for a title. I think that's what he'll aim for, and he'll make no apologies for that. He even still talks to this day about challenging for the title this season. So if he's not doing that, then why is he there?
Do you think that's a real possibility with this Tottenham side next season, pushing for that title?
I think so, yeah. The way he coaches them, he's instantly, and let's not forget, sometimes it takes years for a coach to make his mark or imprint on a team. Ange does it pretty quickly. Yeah. And that's what makes him such a great coach.
It's funny, though, because in the English media, I've noticed a little bit of negativity is creeping in, where it feels like they're almost rooting for him to fail in a way. Have you noticed that? And as someone who has worked in football broadcasting for so long, do you notice any differences between the Australian media and the English media? I noticed that there it's a lot more negative. I don't know if maybe you would have different views. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, as Australian football media, we're nowhere near as harsh as Italian football media or as English football media are. And part of that, rightly or wrongly, is because we're doing what you touched on earlier, and that we're advocates for our sport. So we're trying to promote the sport and not focus on the negative side of things. So if there's a 50-50, we tend to lean on the positive side rather than the negative.
Well, that's you. I've been very negative this interview, I suppose.
But the English media are a lot more harsh and a lot more critical. And you're right, there are people wanting him to fail because he doesn't fit the mould. So they want to say, I told you so. And that just drives someone like Ange even further to prove them wrong.
Do you think that, have you ever seen TalkSport?
I have.
Okay, so I watched that just because I guess I watched it once and now my algorithm keeps feeding it to me. It's like they've gone down the route of pure clickbait. They seem to have pundits on whose job it is not to educate their audience on the game, but to state just outrageous opinions as a way to, annoy people, because annoying people gets views. I guess I shouldn't get you to talk about TalkSport specifically, but would that be a fair assessment, this sort of, clickbaity type of journalism? Yeah,
I think that's becoming a lot more frequent and common, unfortunately. Journalists with some news organisations are remunerated based on the clicks or the rating of a story, and they'll get bonuses if a story hits a certain mark. So that's how some newsrooms work, and it's unfortunate. And whether TalkSport does that or not, I don't know, but it's certainly in this very competitive social media world that we live in, people are competing for clicks, and that would be a way to do it.
How much do you think Ange is single-handedly enhancing Australia's football reputation? Because we've had players play in the big leagues before, but now to have a manager in the Premier League, it says something about, I guess, our technical understanding of the game. In a way, he represents the Australian football community's understanding of football, not just our ability to be athletes and play, but do you see anything there as well?
Yeah, I think as we saw in the early days of, Mark Viduka and Harry Kewell and Mark Schwarzer and Tim Cahill, they paved the way for a lot of Australian footballers to be given an opportunity in the UK, in the English Premier League. Because once you see an Australian footballer performing at that level, then other scouts and other managers are thinking, oh, okay, he's Australian, he can play. And the 2006 World Cup was a great example of that. That was the first time in a long time we've seen Australian footballers performing at the very top level, challenging Italy all the way, and almost pushing Italy out of the tournament, who of course then went on to win the tournament. So just in that way, Ange is doing the same for coaches. He's opening the door for a lot of Australian coaches. So now Australian coaches are becoming part of the conversation in terms of opportunities in Europe. So we've seen Kevin Muscat, who is an understudy, if you like, of Ange in Japan.
He's in China now.
He's now in China. Yep. So he was under Ange in Japan, took over from Ange at Yokohama, won a title there. I think he just fell short last season, and then has now been given a great opportunity in China with one of the biggest clubs in China. And he'll end up in Europe at some point.
I had that on my notes as well.
Patrick Gisnorbo was the other one. Obviously, the Melbourne City coach went to France, had a good opportunity there. Yeah. That didn't go according to plan.
That was a tough job.
But he was given an opportunity. And so I think that's the point. Australian coaches are now being given those opportunities, and partly due to the fact that Ange was so successful at Celtic. Now Harry Kewell is also now got that same job at Yokohama. Yeah.
They love Australian managers for some reason. Do you think it's harder for Australians to succeed abroad?
Absolutely.
There's a prejudice against us, or do we just, is that in our own heads?
It's a dog-eat-dog world there. So you talk to any of the Socceroos who've played in Europe. I'll use the example of Aiden Hrustic. Aiden's was in the Serie A at the start of this season with Verona, and such a cutthroat environment in a club like that. You go there and you're not necessarily welcomed by everybody. They're looking at you and thinking, you're going to take my spot, and they'll kick the living daylights out of you at training. They're not your best mate. They know that you're trying to take their spot. And that's often the case with young Australians who go over there. Alessandro Circati, what a great success story that is. And that story is only going to play out in a lot more positive light for us, for Australian football. A young kid from Perth went over there as a 15-year-old, grew up in Perth, risked everything, just like Aiden Hrustic did when he was 14 or 15 years of age, to go to Europe and try and make his mark. Circati is playing every week for the team who is top of Serie B as a central defender at 19 years of age. This is extraordinary.
That's huge.
It doesn't get enough exposure here. People who understand Italian football know how difficult it is to play in the Serie B, and especially at a club like Parma, who is really a Serie A club, and they're playing in front of packed stadiums every week. The high pressure and high intensity of that environment, that's such a great experience for him. So without putting too much pressure on the kid, I think he's going to be a Socceroo for decades to come.
We were talking off air as well about Serie B. It is a phenomenal league. Yeah. The quality is very high. So to have someone at 19 starting for the top team, yeah, you're right. I mean, he's going places, no pressure, obviously. But Nestor Irankunda, next season, going to Bayern Munich.
Yes.
Is the plan, do you know anything about what the plan is with that deal? Because my assumption is he'd go straight out on loan, but I've also read the plan is to have him actually training with the first team. Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I know it'll be a very difficult transition for him, going to a club that is not just the biggest club in Germany, but one of the biggest clubs in Europe. So for an 18-year-old kid to make that transition from A-League football into European football is difficult. So we wish him all the best, and it's a huge step up for him, and I'd imagine that Bayern Munich will want him to train with the senior team and assess where he's at, both from a physical perspective, both from a technical perspective, and from a mental perspective. Like, does he have the intellect and maturity at this age to play at that level? There are players that do that. Lionel Messi did it at 16, but Lionel Messi is a one of a kind. So I hope it works out for him. And if he does play in the German second division and he's loaned out, then that's also a good thing. To play week in, week out at that level would be a great experience for him. So let's not expect him to play for Bayern Munich next season, because I don't think that will happen.
We already have two players in the German second division at the moment at St. Pauli.
We have another one too, John Idale, who plays in the second division, who just made his Socceroos debut.
Okay, right.
A young striker. But you're right. Jackson Irvine and Connor Metcalf are doing a fantastic job there. Jackson Irvine's captain of that club. They're top of the second division in Germany, so they should get promoted, and they'll be Bundesliga players next season.
Yeah, that's really exciting for them. I want to ask you one last thing about football, and then we'll move on. This is very much my personal projection onto you, so don't feel the pressure to agree with me.
Yes.
Does the word soccer annoy you as much as it annoys me?
It does, but sometimes to explain ourselves in this marketplace, we have to use that dreaded word. I'll use football all the time, but if I'm talking to an AFL person to explain something, then I might have to use the dreaded S word. Yeah, they use it in the US, right? Because they've got a crowded market, and football to them means something else as well.
But it was originally an English word anyway, so we know the history. And I don't have anything against the word per se. I just think in an Australian context, it means something very different. So I consider it, we don't have to get too philosophical here, but a determinate negation. So it when people say it's not football, it's soccer, they're saying, yeah, it's not football. It doesn't belong in the mainstream. It's the little game over there. There's almost language there can be a battle over words, if that makes sense. And I do feel like the word soccer in Australia represents that battle. But that could be me overthinking. Yeah, I'm overthinking. That's totally fine.
No, but that's right. You're right. And I'll always say football, and they'll say, "What do you mean soccer?" I said, "Yeah, football, the round ball, football." That's how I would explain.
And then I catch myself, and then I cringe at myself. I'm like, "Am I being pretentious?"
Not at all. No, we need to stand firm.
But I want to talk to you about your public relations company, Nominis.
Yes.
First of all, tell us about that from your perspective.
Yeah, so I suppose when I meet a lot of people, they think that my full-time career is as a sports broadcaster, and it's not, unfortunately, because of some of the issues we've discussed, because football is not mainstream in this country, and it's not. We'd love it to be, but it's not. There are only a handful of people who work as full-time football journalists or football broadcasters in this country. So all along my journey, I've had a full-time job on top of the football work that I do. So I started my career in radio in a very similar way to that you're doing now, and that was at an Italian, a bilingual station called 3AK, and I started that when I was finished year 12, literally out of school, and I thank the people that gave me the opportunity to do that, Peter Corso and Pony Pizzelli. They gave me an opportunity as an 18-year-old to work as a full-time journalist alongside one of your colleagues today, Ricardo Schiro. So that was a great grounding for me. I worked full-time as a journalist, but as my career developed, I realised that it was difficult to find full-time work in that field. So and juggling sport as well. So I worked in public relations and worked for the Premier of Victoria at the time, who was Jeff Kennett. So I'm now showing my age, and I worked as a media advisor to Jeff Kennett in the late 90s, and then from there that opened the doors to the world of public relations. So from that point, I worked at PR firms and in-house at companies like Telstra, and so my last big job was at Telstra as a media manager for Telstra, a national media manager, which was a pretty intense job. I did that for about 5 or 6 years, and at that point I thought, well, it's time to go out on my own and start my own business and sort of do what I've learned over the last 20 years and do that for myself. So I started up my own business 5 years ago. I've got a partner who I met in Jeff Kennett's office. So we joined forces, and we work with corporate clients, we work with sports industry. The Socceroos is sort of one of our clients as well. And we work to help protect and enhance people's reputation or companies' reputation. So if a crisis hits, we help manage and navigate through a crisis to sort of minimise the damage to a reputation, or to help navigate through those issues that an organisation might be facing. But also on the proactive side of things, we'll help companies tell their story. Sometimes they'll come to us and say, we've got this fantastic solution. How do we get the word out there about what we're doing? And telling good stories is a way to do that.
I imagine it's different for each of your clients, but do you have an overarching philosophy on what makes a good reputation?
It's being honest. It's being open about what you're doing, and it's being transparent. Organisations who don't do that will get quickly found out, whether it's by their customers, whether it's by their own people. We've seen, whistleblowers bring companies down, and it's also about good leadership. So we've seen CEOs fail and bring companies down as well. So through being dishonest, through being non-transparent, so all of those qualities are vital in maintaining a good reputation.
I want to put something to you, and I want to preface this by saying, I hope you don't take this the wrong way. I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. I've always been a little bit uncomfortable when people from the media do PR work, right? Because if we were to agree that one of the roles of journalism is to hold those in power to account, whether they're elected officials or leaders of large corporations, in a way, PR management is helping those in power kind of avoid that or at least battle against that. How do you see that? How do you see, has that crossed your mind?
Absolutely, and I think we try and separate the two, absolutely. So in my football work, I'll obviously never work on a Socceroos game for the media, because the Socceroos is someone that I work for and I help promote. I would never intertwine a client with the work I do in the media. So the corporate work that I do is very separate to the sports work that I do, and never the two shall intertwine. But I think the lessons I've learned as a journalist in the past help me in my public relations business, and you'll find that a lot of people that work in the PR world are former journalists.
Is there any clients that you wouldn't take on?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't name them.
Right, fair
But
enough.
if they don't share the values that we share around transparency, around honesty, and all those things I spoke about, then we would not work for them or with them.
Yeah, my question was going to be, or do you view yourself as similar to a defense attorney, where everyone has the right to media reputation defense, if that makes sense?
There may be some agencies that have that view, but we wouldn't operate in that way.
Well, my next question, which I feel like you're not going to want to answer, is who's the worst person you've helped? Like, who is the worst person? Who do we think is good because of you?
There are some we've worked with, and I won't mention names, that did not take our advice, despite being our clients, and have paid the price for that. And these are former clients we've worked with. And in the end, you sort of want to say, I told you so. But we look at it from a lens when we're offering advice around what's important to that person. And sometimes what's important to that person is not the right thing. Sometimes a person is just about self-preservation and protecting their own personal reputation. That's not what we do. We're there to give advice, to talk about what's the right thing to do. So sometimes the right thing to do is to apologise for something that you've done, not try and defend what you've done. And that's the difference between attorneys, I suppose, sometimes, and what we're doing. We're trying to enhance someone's reputation. And sometimes the way to do that is by apologising and taking ownership for what you've done and right the wrongs that you've done in the past.
And you can really only present that to your client kind of gently, right? And if they don't want to take that advice, they do. What do you do afterwards when it doesn't work out? Is it an I told you so situation, or,
sometimes they lose their jobs.
Right. Yeah.
We don't have to provide the advice that sort of happens, because it ends up turning out badly for them. And the media scrutiny and the pressure around that often causes a demise. Look at Channel 7 at the moment. I wouldn't want to be working in their corporate comms team or representing Channel 7.
That could be a big client for you, though.
It could be. I don't expect.
But you're available. No. You are available, right?
Well, sometimes you make a judgment call, and if we read what we read in the media at the moment about the way they've managed that issue, it's not someone that we'd want to work with. Paying prostitutes and buying cocaine for somebody to get them on an interview is not what I would call good values. Would you?
Definitely not.
If that's what happened.
But
that's what's been alleged.
That's what's been alleged. But do I hear that and go, what? Channel 7? No. They're the beacon of quality journalism, so I get it. I'm not surprised. One of the things I was going to suggest is we could do a little ad for Nominis, is that I give you a crisis and then you later email me a statement and I will read the statement. I'll give you the scenario and then I'll pretend to be that character and then anyone who needs crisis management can look at that and be like, all right, this is pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely happy to play that game. But it's also about telling great stories too. So it's not just about crisis, it's about telling great stories. So there are many clients we work with who have wonderful solutions and just don't know how to tell their story.
Right.
So whether that's getting them a story in Il Globo or whether it's getting them a story in the Herald Sun, and telling a broader public about what they're doing to help. We've worked with a lot of health organisations, so HealthScope, Epworth. We're talking to another one who are focused on heart health. There are some really, really great work that people are doing out there that, stories can be told to a broader audience.
Is there anyone at the moment that you want to give a plug to? Anyone with a particular story that you think is worthwhile?
We don't sort of shout from the rooftops about who we work with, but we're doing a lot of work with Melbourne Water at the moment, the Water Authority in Melbourne, and that came about because of a crisis, because of the Maribyrnong floods, and that was a really difficult period, and it's an ongoing project that we're still working with them almost after 2 years. But there's a lot of wonderful work that's been done at Melbourne Water, but sometimes it's the focus of what happened at the Maribyrnong floods overshadows some of that stuff. So then it's also our job to try and help tell the good story.
I remember what I was going to say before, by the way, and totally wasn't worth it, but you mentioned the Socceroos game against Italy.
Yes.
I often think back to that.
Yes.
It's like a nightmare I can't get rid of, because I believe the next game was Ukraine, right?
Yes, it was.
We win that.
Yes.
We win that.
When you say we, you're talking about the Socceroos.
Of course.
Yes.
Well, Italy did win that. We win that game.
Yeah. And all of a sudden you're in a semi-final.
Right.
Yeah.
Am I crazy? But
no, not at all. And I'm sure most of the players often think that. So this is probably very relevant to this audience. So growing up as an Italo-Australian, born in Australia, always watched Italian football. Sunday mornings, recorded on the VHS, the 1 hour highlight show. So grew up adoring Italian football, adoring the Italian national team. That moment in 2006, I went to the World Cup. I went to the World Cup as a fan with a couple of mates, and I watched Australia's games. I followed Australia in the group stages, and then, like most Aussies, I booked to leave Germany after the group stage and go to Italy to spend some time with family in Italy. So I was in Rimini, where my cousins live in Italy, and watching Australia against Italy in Rimini with a household full of Italians. And it was at that moment that I said to myself, and I realised that I'm Australian. Yes, I have Italian heritage, but I'm Australian. I wanted Australia to beat Italy. It was the first time in my life that I wanted Italy to lose. And that was the light bulb moment. So yes, once Australia were knocked out and we mourned, yes, I wanted Italy to win the World Cup, obviously. But that was a poignant moment, I think, in my life.
Okay, so I'll give you my crisis pitch. I'll tell you the scenario.
Sure.
Okay, you don't have to do this.
Yeah.
I'm a politician in the middle of an election campaign, and a week before the election, I've been caught doing 90 k's an hour in a school zone. That's it.
Yeah, at first I would apologise. Why were you doing that? So you'd have to be very upfront about that.
Do you want a more challenging scenario?
Well, then the next question is, does he stand down a week before the election?
No, he wants to win the election.
Yeah, but maybe the best thing to do to win the election is to stand down, and that's true leadership.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good. See, I went into this thinking your job was to just, help these people sneak through the cracks.
Oh, not really, but he might not take that advice. So then maybe we're not made for each other.
Right.
Because how do you explain 90 k an hour in a 40 k zone? You can't.
Well, that's kind of what I was hoping.
It doesn't pass the pub test.
I was hoping you would work your magic.
No, well, it's not about weaving through.
Yeah, I think
and
I've got
being
this Mad Men style
and being
idea.
sleazy, and it's about doing the right thing. And that's advice we'd be giving.
Well, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this.
No, pleasure. Thanks
I
for
hope I
having
haven't
me.
been too cynical.
Not
for
at
you.
all. No, not at all. Hopefully, I've helped turn the radar a little bit for you.
Absolutely.
In terms of the future of Australian football.
Yeah, no, you have. It's been really great. Thank you again, Michael.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.